Toronto has become known as Canada's inequality capital, with the gap between rich and poor growing faster than in any other major city. In a 25-year period, income inequality there increased by over 30%, far outpacing the national average. Residents themselves recognize this shift. Most say that hard work alone isn't enough to get ahead anymore, pointing to barriers like race, gender, and family background. Inequality doesn't just show up in numbers, it affects everyday life. Many Canadians, especially students and those living on fixed incomes, struggle to afford rent, food, or tuition. Food bank use continues to rise, and financial supports often leave people with just a few dollars a day for basic needs. These conditions affect not only physical health, but also social life and mental well-being. Campaigns have helped draw attention to these issues by challenging public figures to live briefly on food bank supplies, highlighting the stress and limits many people face. Across the country, over 3 million people live in poverty. And globally, inequality is even more extreme. Just a fraction of the population controls most of the world's wealth. This chapter explores poverty in its various forms: absolute, relative, transitional, and more, and the broader systems that shape inequality, including housing instability, mental health, and international disparity. The aim isn't only to inform, but also to spark reflection and hopefully action. Every effort to understand inequality is a step toward challenging it. Canada may be one of the wealthiest countries in the world with universal healthcare and public education, but that doesn't mean everyone has the same access to resources or opportunities. Social inequality exists across cities, across the country, and on a global level. Some people enjoy tremendous wealth and influence, while others live with chronic financial insecurity and limited access to opportunity. Social stratification refers to this structured inequality. It's the way society is divided into layers or strata based on things like income, education, and occupation. People in different social classes often have very different experiences, levels of power, and access to resources. While we often hear stories of individuals rising from poverty to wealth, these stories are rare. They can give the false impression that everyone starts with the same opportunities. In reality, class mobility is often limited by systemic factors. In Canada, we commonly refer to 5 social classes: the upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and lower class. These aren't rigid categories, but they reflect patterns in occupation, income, and lifestyle. For example, the upper class typically includes people with inherited wealth or high-earning entrepreneurs. The lower class, by contrast, often includes those working part-time in unstable jobs or relying on social assistance. Statistics show just how stark the difference is. The top 20% of income earners in Canada had a median net worth of over $1.3 million, while the bottom 10% had just over $1,000. That's not just about money. It's about who can afford to buy a home, who has access to quality education, who can retire comfortably, and who lives paycheck to paycheck. Classism, like racism or sexism, is a form of systemic oppression. It stems from the belief that everyone has equal opportunity, so those who succeed must have earned it, and those who struggle must have failed. This ignores the structural barriers many people face, such as discrimination, generational poverty, or lack of access to stable employment and education. It also ignores how wealth and power are preserved and passed down. When thinking about your own position in society, consider which class you identify with today and whether you expect that to change in the future. How much of your future depends on your own effort, and how much might be shaped by social structures outside your control? These are key questions in understanding how stratification affects real-life chances. Let's continue with an example of social inequality. By noon on the first workday of the year, Canada's top CEOs has already made as much as the average worker earns in an entire year. That kind of disparity brings us to the core question: how do we measure inequality? Canada doesn't have an official poverty line, so we rely on 3 main tools. The first is the Low Income Cutoff, or LICO. This looks at how much a family has to spend on necessities like food, shelter, and clothing. If those costs eat up a larger share of a family's income than the national average, that family falls below the LICO. Then we have the low income measure, or IM. This is more about comparisons. If your income is less than half of what the median household earns, you're considered to be living in low income. It adjusts for household size, recognizing that bigger families have bigger needs. The third tool is the market basket measure, or MBM. This is our only absolute measure. It calculates how much money a family needs to cover a specific list of basic goods and services like food, clothing, shelter, and transportation. This measure is now Canada's official poverty line and varies depending on where you live, since costs differ by region. Each of these tools gives us slightly different numbers. In 1 year, the LICO said 3.2 million Canadians were living in low income. The MBM found 3.5 million, and the LAM said 4.4 million. That shows us that even the way we define poverty can shape the story we tell about who's struggling. Poverty isn't just about income. We need to think about other dimensions too. Absolute poverty means lacking the basic essentials, food, clothing, or shelter. Relative poverty is about having less than what most people around you have. It's about not being able to afford what's considered normal in society. There are also different patterns of poverty. Transitional poverty happens when someone faces a short-term financial crisis, like losing a job. If there's no support, this can turn into marginal poverty, where stable work is hard to come by, or even chronic poverty, which can stretch on for years. And when children grow up in that environment, it often becomes intergenerational poverty, passed from one generation to the next. Poverty can also be cultural or spiritual. People might feel excluded or disconnected, not because of money alone, but because of a sense of not belonging. These deeper dimensions remind us that poverty is about more than material things. It's also about power, access, and inclusion. Poverty in Canada affects over 3 million people and isn't experienced equally. Groups like seniors, people with disabilities, recent immigrants, Indigenous communities, lone parents, and children face higher risks of poverty. Among the most concerning issues is child poverty. About 639,000 children were living in poverty in 2009. These children are more likely to suffer from health issues like asthma and malnutrition, lack access to prescription and dental care, and face educational disadvantages that can persist into adulthood. Canada's international ranking in child well-being remains low, with children in low-income families experiencing significantly worse outcomes than their peers. Student poverty is another growing issue. The common image of the starving student masks a more serious reality. Rising tuition fees, reduced public funding for post-secondary education, and an unstable job market are forcing students into difficult financial positions. Many rely on food banks, skip meals, or drop out entirely to avoid accumulating unmanageable debt. Then we have the working poor, those in precarious employment. These individuals may work part-time, contract, or multiple low-wage jobs, yet still earn below the poverty line. Minimum wage earners working full-time may not make enough to cover basic living expenses. Precarious jobs often come with no benefits, no job security, and high stress levels. This kind of employment is now widespread, even in sectors once considered stable. The psychological toll is significant, contributing to poor mental health and reduced community engagement. Poverty, whether experienced as a child, student, or low-wage worker, has lasting impacts on health, education, and social inclusion. Tackling it requires more than charity or temporary aid. It requires structural change, inclusive policies, and a commitment to equity at all levels of society. Before the 1980s, the term homelessness didn't even exist in its current conceptual form. Previously, people were simply referred to as the homeless. But growing social, political, and economic shifts, especially cutbacks to housing programs and social supports in the 1980s and 1990s, revealed the need to understand homelessness as a broader systemic issue. Today, homelessness refers to the condition of lacking stable, safe, and adequate housing for any reason, and not just to individuals visibly living on the streets. There are different forms of homelessness. Absolute homelessness refers to people living on the streets or in emergency shelters. Hidden or concealed homelessness includes individuals staying temporarily with others, in cars, or in institutions like prisons, without a home of their own. Relative homelessness refers to people who live in unsafe or unsuitable housing or are at risk of losing their homes. Counting the homeless is difficult, but estimates suggest between 200,000 and 300,000 Canadians are without stable shelter. Risk factors for homelessness include poverty, unaffordable housing, mental illness, domestic violence, and substance abuse. For every visibly homeless person, there are many more in hidden homelessness. One critical driver of homelessness is the deinstitutionalization of mental health care starting in the 1960s. While medications and therapy created new hopes for community-based care, the reality was a sharp drop in psychiatric beds without adequate community support. Many people with mental illness were left without care, housing, or family support, making them highly vulnerable to homelessness. Today, it's estimated that 25 to 50% of the homeless population have mental illnesses, and many face overlapping substance use issues. The At-Home Chez Soi project, launched in several Canadian cities, tested the housing first approach. Rather than requiring treatment or sobriety first, participants were offered immediate access to housing and optional support services. The program prioritized participant choice, ensuring housing costs were kept below 30% of income. It proved highly effective, improving quality of life and housing stability while reducing reliance on shelters, hospitals, and jails. It also showed that offering housing first is economically viable in the long run. Homelessness today is not just a personal tragedy. It is a reflection of systemic failures in housing, income support, mental health care, and social policy. Effective solutions must address both immediate needs and long-term systemic barriers. The Gini index is the most widely used tool to measure income inequality in a society, ranging from 0, where everyone has equal income, to 1, where one person has it all. So the lower the number, the more equal the income distribution. In Canada, inequality actually decreased during the 1980s and hit a low of 0.281 by 1989. But that trend reversed in the 1990s, and inequality rose again. It's hovered around 0.32 into the 2000s. Now, how does Canada compare internationally? Out of 17 peer countries, we rank 12th for income inequality. That means there are 11 countries doing better in terms of equality. The most equal countries are Denmark and Sweden, with Gini scores around 0.23. Canada's at 0.317, better than the US, which sits at 0.381, but still significantly behind countries like France and Finland. To tackle global inequality, the United Nations launched the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which picked up where the Millennium Development Goals left off. The MDGs achieved some big things. More than 1 billion people moved out of extreme poverty. Child mortality and the number of out-of-school children were both cut in half, and HIV/AIDS infections dropped by nearly 40%. Building on that, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are ambitious and wide-reaching. They aim to end poverty and hunger, improve education and health, ensure clean water and energy access, and promote sustainable development and peace, all while specifically targeting the reduction of inequality both within and among countries. Intersectionality highlights how multiple social identities like gender, race, and age interact to create overlapping forms of disadvantage. Let's start with gender. In 2010, 9.3% of women in Canada lived on a low income. This is linked to both unpaid and underpaid work. Women spend more time on unpaid domestic and childcare, about 13.8 hours a week, compared to 8.3 hours for men. They also face a wage gap. In 2011, women earned about 2/3 of what men made. They're overrepresented in precarious jobs, making up 70% of part-time workers and 2/3 of minimum wage earners. This makes single mothers especially vulnerable. 36% of their families live below the poverty line, and 43% of children in low-income homes live with a single mom. Race also plays a major role. Immigrants often face housing insecurity due to high rent and low income. Many earn under $20,000 annually, while rents in cities like Toronto are extremely high. Discrimination and language barriers only make things worse. Indigenous people are overrepresented among Canada's homeless. Though they make up less than 4% of the national population, they account for 10% of the homeless and up to 30% in cities like Vancouver. In Nunavut, 70% of Inuit homes are food insecure, with basic necessities like bottled water and vegetables costing multiple times more than in southern regions. Lastly, age is another key factor. Youth aged 16 to 24 make up nearly 1/3 of Canada's homeless population. Many come from backgrounds marked by poverty, foster care, group homes, and family violence. Studies show they're exposed to dangerous conditions on the street: unsafe sex, drug use, violence, poor nutrition, and very limited access to medical or social services. This intersectional lens helps us see how these factors combine to deepen inequality and complicate efforts to address it. So let's conclude today's lecture by breaking down the difference between equality and equity, because they're not the same thing, even though people sometimes use them like they are. Equality is about giving everyone the exact same thing, no matter who they are or what their situation is. Sounds fair on the surface, right? But it doesn't take into account that people have different needs. Now, equity is different. Equity is about giving people what actually fits their specific needs. It's about meeting people where they are, rather than assuming that the same solution works for everyone. A great way to illustrate this is the classroom shoe exercise. Think about this. What if we handed out the exact same size of shoes to every student in class? That would be equality. Everyone gets the same pair. But most people would end up with shoes that don't fit. Too small, too big, maybe even the wrong type. Equity in this case would be making sure everyone gets shoes in their own size. That's what actually works for them. This shows us how uniform treatment can actually lead to unfair outcomes. It ignores difference in context. Equity, on the other hand, takes those differences seriously. It allows for self-definition and gives people a say in what they need. And this leads us to fairness. Fairness isn't just about treating everyone the same. It's about giving people the power to choose, to collaborate, and to shape what works best for them. That's a more meaningful kind of justice. So justice isn't about sameness. It's about being responsive. It's about empowering people to thrive based on their unique circumstances.